Ready for sketty, yes. That is what we're here for. My name is Jason O'Neill. I work at a Melbourne-based company called Culture Amp, and they're an employee feedback platform. But I do remote work, and people often ask me how that is, being in Perth when your whole team is on the other side of the country. And it's good, but you sometimes miss out on like the office cakes and whatever. And then yesterday, a late delivery from Australia Post. How nice is that? Anyway, I like where I work. I'm surprised it didn't melt over the Easter weekend, but that's okay. But we're not here to talk about chocolate, we're here to talk about spaghetti. And we're not talking about Culture Amp, we're talking about my last job. And so the story starts in 2016, and I was on the hunt for a new job, and have you ever seen an opportunity that looked like it would be amazing, but then once you committed, the reality wasn't quite what you expected? Happens in all areas of life, and for me it was happening when I'd closed down my startup. I was looking for a job, and I wanted to stay in the education industry, and I came across this company that was a small team. They had a really innovative product. I was really impressed with the way they were changing teaching and learning. I was excited to join their front-end team, and they interviewed, they were quick to make an offer, and I accepted the job. And started working right away, but it wasn't until I started that I realized I wasn't joining the front-end team, I was replacing the one person who just left. I was the front-end team. And someone had just left and left behind 50,000 lines of spaghetti. It was a mess. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, looking at something and it feels amazing on the outside, but then hidden underneath every button and element is a bug, and every time you try to do something it takes longer than you think. And you go through stages of tech debt denial. It starts with the big love heart eyes. This product is amazing. And then as you begin to explore the code base, you realize there's a lot more to it. There's features you didn't know about, like entire pages you're still finding 6 months after you started. You going along, you're like, okay, so it's a little big, but there's a bug and I'm trying to fix it, but I'm having trouble figuring out where the code is even getting called from. But I think I can fix it anyway, but I'm still a little unsure, so I fix it, but break two other things. You're beginning to panic at this point, but then you remember this is called technical debt. This is when a team has moved fast to build a product and they've left behind some code that should be cleaned up. And you're like, don't worry, I'll just refactor it. I'll clean it up. But then you go to refactor it and you can't change the button without changing 35 files and 2,000 lines. And your head begins to explode. And then you realize there's no test coverage, no type checking, no linting. And then the final stage is acceptance. So, except not really. My fellow developer and I were determined to turn the ship around. We wanted to not accept it. We wanted to make this code as clean and as nice to work with as the product was supposed to be for our customers. So this is just a short talk, so I'm not going to give the full story, but I'm going to share a few of the things that we came across, the challenges and the spaghetti factors, and what we did about them. The first is bad names. We heard before how naming things is one of the hardest things to do. I'm not talking about naming children like John Smith or Northwest. I'm talking about naming the variables in your code and the files in your code. We made an app for schools, and so our data looked like this. You had a school, and inside a school was a bunch of classes. A class would usually have about 20 students, and then the students had lessons. Now, we did differentiated learning, so it wasn't one lesson for all the students. It was each student could be learning a different thing at the same time. Super cool, super innovative. But what do you think we called these things in our code base? Well, we didn't just have students, you also had teachers, and we thought maybe one day they would be parents. So we didn't call them students, we called them users. Makes sense, I guess. Classes, class you might know is a reserved word in JavaScript and PHP, which our backend was. So we couldn't call them classes, so I guess a class is a group of students. We wanted to call them lessons, but then is it a lesson if it's like a quiz where you're not learning, you're getting tested? And so we just went for a generic name like modules. And then schools, well, not all of the customers were schools. There were some adult learning organizations. So we'll call it tenant, except I don't know how to spell tenant. So that change made it into the database, resulting in bugs like this, where you accidentally spell tenant correctly. Why do you hate me? So it just makes it difficult when you're trying to talk to your non-technical users, and the names they use for everything are different to the names you use for everything. And then it gets more difficult when you add a new feature, like we want to have a group of students. And so what do you call a group of students when the word group is already taken? We're division, And so then this just makes it so bug prone, because you get something like this where it says group.addStudent, and you're like, wait, is this adding it to the class or adding it to the small group within the class? I've got no idea, absolutely no idea. Except of course the names looked more like that, group service.addStudent, group model, student model. You just add all this programming jargon. Have you ever noticed programmers tend to like their technical names? It's not a TV, it's an entertainment provider singleton. It's not a door, it's a visitor, it's an indoor session initializer. And it's not a couch, it's a multi-butt supporter. So how do you untangle this? You can avoid jargon in your names, just don't use words that don't need to be there. Call it what it is, so if your users call it a class and that word's taken from you, find a way to still call it a class. So you might call it a school class. If they call it a school, don't call it a misspelled tenant. And as you rename things, you can worry that you'll miss stuff. So if you've got type checking like TypeScript or Flow, this makes the process of cleaning stuff up way easier. They will also help you untangle your code. That was a key thing for us. We used Flow and it was great. The next thing was scope soup. Has anyone ever heard of this? No? So many bugs that you can see, and it was particularly bad with Angular 1, and it can be particularly bad with CSS if you're not careful. They come from having too much stuff on the same scope. What do I mean by that? We'd have a component like this, and it's just supposed to show a user and a logo and their name or something. I don't know. Anyway, there's two variables in there, in between the kind of mustache brackets. One is called user and one is called company. And you go, where does user and company come from? The only problem is you look at the related JavaScript and there's nothing about user or company there. The user and the company are just on this magical Angular thing called a scope, and they could be anywhere in your 50,000 lines of code and you have no way to know where. So that's pretty terrible, and the fix is to explicitly say, I want to isolate my scope. I want to say anything that I use has to come from exactly here. So that's what you'd have to do in Angular 1. Angular 2 kind of fixed all that. If you use React, you kind of get this built in with prop types and those kind of things. But the idea is to use imports and modules, and if you're going to use something, explicitly pull it in. Don't just assume it's going to exist somewhere on the window object or whatever. If you're using CSS, have like a good naming convention. I loved your talk about selectors, but I'd always like namespace them to a page so that a selector rule you change here doesn't suddenly break some completely unrelated thing in an import modal that you forgot existed. And if you're using Angular 1, is anyone here still writing Angular 1 code? Oh, you lucky people. It's awful. So if you're using that, replace it either with React or Vue or Angular 2 or something, anything. Next problem we had was abstractions. So I was saying just before, when you write 20 lines of code as your first kind of I'm a developer, you can just write it all in one thing. As you get to like 200 lines of code, you begin to add functions and maybe a class or something to split it up and to give structure to your code. As you get to 2,000, you might start to move things into different files. And then the bigger and bigger you get, as you get like past 20,000, etc., you really start needing ways to structure your code. And so that's why we come up with things like model view controller. And the model is kind of your data, your view is how you render it, and the controller controls things. But you might not want that. You might want a model view model controller because you heard that was better and you're not really sure why. If you're in the Angular world, all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of new abstractions that like dependency injections and decorators and services, and what is the difference? I'm not sure. From the Java land, you might have a factory controller somewhere. I don't know if anyone's ever seen those in the wild, but you might be embarrassed to call it that, so you'll call it a provider factory controller. And then my favorite from this code base was, there was one called a data strategy. I still have no idea what it is. So we had some code like this, and it was called a module data strategy, again with the name. What on earth is a module? And so it pulled in a service, a social service, which was used for like commenting on answers and things like that, and running discussions. And then each of the functions here just called the other service. So get activity discussion comments just called get discussion comments. It did nothing. And save activity discussion comments just saved the discussion comment. It literally did nothing other than pass things through to another file. And so when you're trying to debug and you're trying to follow it, there's just all these indirections. You think that you're following it and the bug is here, and then you go, okay, so that's called from here. What does that do? Absolutely nothing. So that's called from here. What does that do? Nothing. That's called from here. Oh, now that's where the value got passed in. You're adding indirection and you're messing it up. And so we just set about refactoring, just going, let's get rid of it and just use the social service. It does exactly the same thing. And so the commit message, when I got rid of that, I was pretty happy. Boom. In terms of when you're talking about abstractions, for front-end architecture, there is one abstraction that I think is worth pursuing, and I copy it from Elm. Have any of you heard of Elm? Elm is this kind of like hipster functional programming language that enforces a lot of safety. We use it a little bit at CultureAmp, but they have a really great take on architecture, and it's been copied by things like Redux, MobX, and a few other frameworks. And what it is you have a model, and this is the state of your page, and it might say we have these, the class name is this, we've got these 24 students, and each of them is at this level of progress in their current lesson. And so that's the data of your page. And then you have a way to update the state. So you have an action which might say this student just finished a lesson, load the next one, or this student just got added to the class, add them to the list. And so you have a way to update the state or update the model. And then the view is a way to view that model or the state as HTML. That is the abstraction. That's all you really ever need in front-end code. I know I'm oversimplifying it, but most of the frameworks I've seen which make good code for the long term and are maintainable follow something pretty close to that. You have your state, you have a specific action, way of defining actions that change the state, and then you can render that at any point. So how do you untangle all these abstractions? Think in terms of the Elm architecture. You can read up about it online if you want. You don't have to use Elm to copy the way they do it. And if you want to try something new, if you read a blog post which is like, you know, it's all about model, view model controller, or there's this new thing called data strategies, or whatever it is you're reading, and it's exciting, I'd encourage you to try it separately first. Don't always just introduce a new abstraction just because you read it on Medium earlier today. So that's one way to try and clean it up, and get rid of, if there's any abstractions that just add indirection, they add no value, they just make it harder to see what's actually going on, try to get rid of it. So finally, we had this one problem that was pretty awful. Have any of you ever had to deal with memory leaks in JavaScript? Yes, a few defeated looking faces around the room. It's not much fun. We got reports that stuff was going slow, and we'd have memory usage that looks like that, and then we started getting reports that students had their iPads crashing. Safari would just bomb out, and students would be crying and be like, where did my work go? And we felt pretty bad. So I was wondering, where do memory leaks come from? And so you start Googling and you get some Stack Overflow answers, and there's a lot of stuff which is just like generic advice, like clean up your event handlers and your event listeners, sorry. But I found that kind of stabbing in the dark approach that I was taking didn't work for me, and this was a chance for me to learn the tools and actually begin to level up as a developer rather than just relying on tutorials and searching for stuff. I had to learn what it was to actually understand the problems and find the right diagnostic tools to dive deep into it. So to show this, I've got a code pen. This great page here is a single page app, and you can switch from page to page. How good is that? Are you impressed? Did any of you see how much RAM that was using? No? That's using 1.5 gigabytes of RAM. So the reason it's doing that is because there's memory leaks, and every time I change page, I've got a deliberate memory leak in there, leaking stuff. But then in Chrome, and I've managed to find stuff which showed me how to do this. This is really hard to see. I might need to bump the font size. You have a memory tab, and in memory tab, you have an allocation timeline. And so what I can do is I can record, and then you can see every time I click a page, it's allocating memory, and then when I change page, a little bit is freeing up. So the dark bit is what's allocated, and then the lighter bit is what got freed up when you left. And as you can see, what you want is for all of it to be light and for you to be leaving nothing behind. But you've got these sections of dark. And what do? Well, you can come in and you can go, show me what was there during that click, show me what happened. And I'm not sure why that's not showing anything. Because it's still loading. The reason it's still loading is because I let it leak 1.5 gigabytes of memory. Yeah. So, but in doing this, I'm not showing you this as like, haha, here's the one tool you need. The moral of this story was I was not equipped to deal with the problems I was facing with my current level of knowledge. And I had to accept that to solve this, I'm going to have to go do some learning and really understand my tools and become more of an engineer and less of a hacking Stack Overflow person. So you can go, you can select a click, you can go, there's an array, and then we can click in there and it will show you the array is being held onto by the page history object on window. And then if we looked at our code pen, you can begin to search and go, oh, that's where our leak is. So that was the story of that. That was how I began to unravel that, which was fun. So how to untangle stuff like that? As I said, some stuff is legitimately hard. So don't view it as this is terrible, this is the end of the world, like I did at first. Use it as a chance to level up. The worse the code is and the bigger your problems are, the more you've got a chance to learn and improve yourself as a developer. Which brings me to my conclusion. How I learned to stop worrying and love the spaghetti. Which I think this image is quite fitting, really, this little girl. So we switched from Angular to React, just replacing one component at a time, one square at a time, rather than trying to do the whole thing at once. We switched from just concatenating our JavaScript files to using a proper module system like Webpack. We added Flow for type checking. TypeScript's just as good. We added unit tests and end-to-end tests, and we started doing stuff. We created bug scores so that with our team we had a metric that they could understand this is our progress on reducing technical debt and our ability to fix stuff. And slowly we started to win. But really, the bigger lesson for me was that spaghetti code at first made me feel really dumb. It made me feel like a really crap developer because they'd be like, hey, can you change this button color? And I'd change it and then break 3 things. But what I realized over time is that it's not a sign you're a bad programmer. When you can see that the code is horrible, it's a sign that you're beginning to know there's a better way to do it. And the chance to go back and clean it up is your chance to improve as a developer, my chance to improve. And so even though jumping into this, it wasn't the opportunity I expected, I'm really grateful for it. And I left feeling a lot smarter and a lot more confident in myself that I can notice these patterns and find better ways to do things. So when you see it for what it is and start moving to improve it, you know you're getting better. So that's my talk. Now at Culture Amp, they also have spaghetti code in old parts of the base, code base. I think almost everyone has it somewhere. But these guys at least value unit testing and end-to-end testing, so that's a win. Yeah.